Hello, everyone. This is Mike Wilkerson. I'm the founder of Stormwall Advisors, the host of Stormwall.com, and the author of Why America Matters. With me today is my good friend, Scott Massey. Scott, you and I have known each other for 30 years. You started your career as a combat officer with the U.S. Army. I would say most of the time over the past 30 years, when I've tried to reach you, I haven't been able to because you've been doing something unknown in some of the, well, very difficult parts of the world, some inhospitable jurisdictions, whether in Africa, in the Middle East, Nigeria, East Africa, and you have spent time in Yemen, which of course is going to be what we want to talk about today. You've been in both business and military contexts. You worked on military defense equipment, software industry, medical industries. You have advised and continue to advise senior military and government officials around critical issues around defense, around escalation of force systems, counter piracy, and countering violent extremism, all issues that we are faced with today. You've recently sort of returned to your military roots, and you're serving a 3-year full-time tour of duty with the South Carolina National Guard, and focused on, again, the Middle East and some of the issues that we're talking about around there. So Scott, why don't we start there? I mean, I want to talk about the current conflict in the Middle East. We can talk about it broadly, but specifically, would love to start around what's happened recently in Yemen. And I wanted to just maybe start by something that just caught my eye, and then ask you for sort of your view on what's going on and the backup. It was about 6 months ago when we got news last year from the mainstream media and from the Biden administration that there was peace in the Middle East. So going back to the middle of last year, NPR and a bunch of other media came out with this view that situation in Yemen was winding down. Maybe there was a path to peace with the Houthis. You spent time there, you'll talk about it. But then we get this was the piece that took the cake for me, which was that National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan comes out, what was it, less than 2 weeks before the Hamas attack, terrorist attack on Israel, and says that the Middle East is quiet. We have peace in the Middle East, something we haven't seen in over 2 decades. Maybe we start there, and before I just turn it over to you to ask what's going on, I just want to give the viewers just a couple other impressions of some of the events that have happened, just so everybody's kind of up to speed about what we're talking about, although I think most people are going to be aware. So just a few days ago, the U.S., along with a coalition of others, launched some strikes against the Houthi rebels targeted in Yemen. They did this, what was so-called Operation Prosperity Garden, U.S., and then a couple of other allies, although I have to admit, not a whole lot of European nations, not France, not Germany, not others, to work together to take on this situation. Well, what was the situation? Well, since the end of November, for about 2 months now, we've had tens of multiple attacks by Houthi rebels using mostly drones and other relatively low-cost, low-tech on Red Sea commercial shipping, and there have been a number that were intercepted by U.S. and others, but this was becoming a very important issue. And the last thing I'll say, and just jump on, is for everyone's awareness, and I'd love if you can underscore this a bit. Why was this so critical? Why has this become such an issue? The Suez Canal is the choke point, the connection between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean, the shortest route between Europe and Asia. 20% of all global container traffic, around 10 or 12% of oil and gas. The alternative is to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. This was a situation I think last faced seriously in World War II, where the Allies were forced to take this long route, extra 6,500 kilometers, another week or more, plus the cost pressures that invokes. And of course, the UN has long been, post World War II, in this role of the guardian of keeping those open. Shipping markets have been completely rattled, so we see the consumer price index has tripled in 1 month from where we were in November to today. So why don't we stop there, and in terms of just the image sharing, so that you can talk a bit. But I'd love to just get into this a little bit. I gave that summary, but what's happened and why? Why are we here? And would welcome your sort of personal background, your experience in Yemen during this very difficult time of civil war and conflict.
Yeah, well, thanks, Mike, for having me on. Yeah, that's to say that the region is contentious is quite the understatement. We probably haven't seen this much turmoil since the Obama administration, and there was a lot of movement of regime overthrow at that period of time. We're seeing it again. A lot of powder keg pressures that exist are, they're letting off steam. I mean, it's, you almost feel like, gosh, I got to keep up with it constantly because, now we've got the Iranians and the Pakistanis going at it. The Iranians are lobbing, guided missiles into Syria and Iraq. There's just so much always going on. But, how did we get here? Uh, how long do we want to how long do we want to go back? And I think it's just fitting. Let's just take the current crisis and then fold it back a little bit that can lay out this framework. Yemen, probably one of the I've been to a lot of countries, 60 plus at this point, and Yemen is probably the most exotic of any I've been, and it's got a mix of, you feel as if you have stepped back into the Quranic age. It is, Muhammad is like relevant, and the language, even the language in Yemen is ancient Arabic. Very in touch with the Quran and the people. And it's a wonderful country. Really, really enjoyed my time there. But the challenges of Yemen is it's got a lot of ancient culture, but you've got a lot of rivalry. And for a long time, and when I was there, Saleh, Ali Abdullah Saleh was the basically ruler. You can call him whatever you want. He ruled, but he ruled via largesse. He paid off tribes and kept them all aligned with largesse from the government. Well, over time, things got untenable. The Zaydi, Shia aligned peoples, who are now commonly called Houthi, really became disenchanted. There was a push to remove Saleh, resigned, stepped down. Another gentleman came in, Hadi, and then pressures really got out of line, and then a civil war broke out. And that civil war lasted about 5 years. The Saudi government got involved. The Emirati government got involved, with troops deployed on the ground. Very, very bloody.
And Scott, in those cases, presumably on the side of government against the Houthi rebels backed by Iran. Is that the simplified way to think about it? Or,
right. Well, let's say, don't align it with the government. Say, let's go with Sunni Shia. It was a Sunni Shia strife. The Zaydi are a Shia group. The Saleh and his regime was Sunni, but the Zaydi is a major Shia influence there. So you saw those fissures break apart, and the civil war really was along those more religiously identified lines. Although if you study Yemen a little bit, there have been contention there between the north and the south as well. Some of those are, again, Sunni Shia break aparts, and it even turned into the Cold War with Cold War divides, and so all these things play on whatever is the current relevance, but they all seem to find their similar division points along the same alliances. So we had that for 5 years. I mean, they're talking anywhere between 300 to 500,000 people have been killed. You have 11 to 15 million people displaced. It's a massive immigration problem. The starvation that's going on in Yemen is just, it is a cataclysmic, apocalyptic type scenario. And then you have,
sorry, Scott, to ask, and why is that? Is that because the government is simply non-functioning in terms of service delivery and being able to give?
Yep.
It's just such a strong statement. And I've heard a lot of questions raised about this. So what is the cause of the humanitarian crisis there?
It's cataclysmic, and there's no order there to establish any kind of relief effort, anything that gets brought in. And truth be told, there's a lot of things coming into the country, but mostly, things to wage war with. There isn't a focus yet on the humanitarian crisis. It's still a conflict zone. And while the Saudis and the Emiratis have withdrawn their troops, they're still, now you have a lot of internal conflict still ongoing. Of course, it doesn't really matter to those of us externally because we don't see it. So, you see these now you have this opportunistic development with Hamas attacking Israel, and now you've got a lot of transit down the Red Sea, as is normal, and the Houthis now see a target of opportunity. And the truth is, the Iranians see an opportunity, and they're kind of fomenting this. They're putting multiple pressures. Initially, the Houthis came out and stated that, hey, we're going to attack Israeli shipping. Well, now you've got now they're expanding that to U.S. shipping, and any kind of shipping that's coming down the Red Sea channel that isn't friendly Iranian. And some of that's, so we've begun to interdict some of the shipping along that line that we're calling Iranian. So now you've got two people interdicting shipments. Now you have them deploying drones and missiles. The
And Scott,
Houthis,
I'm just
again,
going to pop while you're talking. I want to pop on this screen that just shows the map because you're more familiar with this than I am. But you look at this, and Houthi-controlled areas appear to be, yeah, the areas on the coast, on the Red Sea coast. In other words, they have direct access for naval, maritime, and vessels and drones, whatever else. Is that a part of what's going on here? Is just the actual proximity and access to these ports?
yeah, yes, and it is one of the major control points on the globe. I mean, so much traffic as one of your earlier slides showed. There's anywhere between 10 and 20% of the shipping containers go through there. You've got massive amounts of the oil goes through there. Obviously, a lot of oil is coming out of this region for to then be refined. So you've got both unrefined and refined stuff coming back and forth, and it's a major choke point. And like any major choke point, those that control that strait can control a lot of other things, and it's an opportunity for the Houthis. And again, do not consider the Houthis acting on their own. This is an Iranian proxy. It's a Shia Iranian proxy, and that has to be held within the context of everything that's going on here, of which Hamas is also. Now, Hamas is a Sunni proxy, which is really, that starts to break apart a lot of the old lines of alliance. But yeah, you have Hamas aligned with Iran, Hezbollah, Shia aligned with Iran. Now you have the Houthis, Shia aligned with Iran against everybody, against the world kind of thing.
Yeah. And maybe just describe a little bit about Iran's, in your view. I mean, I know this is a very complicated issue, but their motives and questions, because this is very dangerous on all sides. I mean, people are talking about, well, China wants a war, Iran wants a war, Russia wants a war. I find that all very hard to believe because we know how devastating war is, especially in the modern age. China's trying to build its economy. Russia's trying to get out of sanctions jail. They're very around. All of these have domestic political considerations that they have to be thinking about. So it seems to the extent that Iran is trying to provoke something, it feels like a very dangerous game. Maybe you could describe a little bit about what you think they're actually trying to do through this process.
Yeah. That is a great question. And there's many things being posited. Iran is not an irrational actor. I think that's what we must start with, that there's a line of rationality that they pursue. They also have a legacy of being a regional hegemon. The Persian Empire was a major force. That does matter to them. There is a Shia mandate that there's certain things that if they do under Islamic Shiaism, this brings about the return of the Mahdi, and there's a religious context with this. So you have a legacy of power, you have a legacy of hegemony. You have then you have an understanding of religious conviction that drives them, as well as they feel that they are the victim. They have been mistreated by the West, and there's a way of them protecting themselves by pushing their borders out. Their Quds force has been very, very active for a long time, and the Quds project force. That's their basic, element that pushes the proxies around the other places, from Bahrain to everywhere. If there's a Shia alliance, they foment it, and then they produce antagonistic actions against the Sunnis, or in this case, right now, the Israelis. So, I think their idea is like most. They want a more secure space for them to operate in, and that is going to be found by pushing against all those they see as antagonistic to their goals.
I wanted to focus in on something you said, which is that Iran is acting rationally. And, there's certainly in the Western media, what we hear is that Putin's crazy. He's gone mad, and he's just totally irrational in what he's doing. Iran, same thing. John Mearsheimer has this sort of discussion around rationality of state actors. And, his point is that not whether your strategy is ultimately going to succeed or not, but it is, did you take in the information you had at a particular point in time? Did you use it in a deliberative process with some consensus, and then even if the ruler ultimately has to make the decision, at least there was gathering of information, both sides are heard, debated, and then a decision is taken. rationality in that sense. Doesn't mean, by the way, that I suppose religious considerations, as you talked about, aren't taken into account, but it is looking objectively at the hand that they're dealt at the time. And putting Russia aside for a second, in the case of Iran, they've been under U.S. sanctions regime, one of the stiffest in the world for a very long time now, a couple decades now, and having to work within that realm. So I think it just reminds me of the importance of really, in order to understand the situation, really trying to understand how the other side thinks without just saying, well, they're anti-American or they're this or that. All that may be true, but it doesn't do anything to educate or help us understand the why. If we don't understand the why, then there's no way that we can really take a different course or actually find our way out of this Gordian knot. I want to shift a little bit now and just talk about how did we get here into the situation as the United States, because many of us woke up one morning, we were aware of the attacks, the drone attacks and other things on commercial traffic, mostly Israeli destined or otherwise. At least at that point, it hadn't been on U.S. commercial merchant ships. No direct attacks, to my knowledge, at that point on naval or maritime vessels of the United States Armed Forces. It had been commercial. And I just want to go back and just do a little bit of a prelude here and say that we can come back to that. And by the way, before we move on, well, actually, we'll come back to it. Let's talk about this. So I wrote a bit of a tongue-in-cheek title, and I said the continental Biden administration relieves itself on the U.S. Constitution. And the point I was making was that the president of the United States and the administration, although it's hard to tell who was actually in charge in making this decision, with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin in the hospital, President Biden not really addressing the issue at all. So whether this was a military decision, even less than without its civilian oversight. But the main point that I was trying to make here was that there was no support of Congress. In other words, the administration did not go to Congress to ask whether this made sense or not. And what was interesting to me is the administration did get quite a bit of pushback, not just from Republicans, but from both sides of the House, saying, hold on, you're starting a war, you're going beyond what you should. And so, Scott, the question I wanted to raise to you, having thought about this longer than perhaps I have, is who decides? Who gets to make this decision here of when the U.S. goes to war? I've got some backup slides we can come on to, but let me just close the show for a second and just get you to comment on sort of principles as you understand it, and then let me know if you want me to pop up the the background text and we can go through it.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like accounting. Who's asking? So yeah, who decides? Well, the way the language goes, and while I'm not a lawyer, I was raised by one, but I am not one. But language does matter, and the law does have some very specific things laid out. Article 1 certainly is empowering of the Congress. Article 2, the executive, and there's definitely some things that are. Congress was given the right to declare war. The president is given powers of making war. Those two things don't necessarily coincide, and so. I think it's a legitimate question to be had from either side. Each has their responsibility. What is amazing to me is usually the question is framed around the president doesn't have that, can't do that. And I go, well, yeah, he does. He does have that. Now, there's been resolutions since 1973 to kind of refine that and give some presidential right and left limits on what force they can use for duration and reasoning. But the bottom line is Congress has a distinct role and responsibility. And then, like many things in the United States right now, Congress seems to be absent. Where are they? What are they doing? And you can say, 435 people in the House and 100 in the Senate, they can't work it out in time and a timeliness with it. And that may be true, but it doesn't change the role that Congress needs to assert itself. If it feels like things are being acted inappropriately, well, there's a number of steps they can do from a budgetary, discretionary standpoint and a number of things. And we seldom see them do it. And that's, I think, even as a Defense Department employee and someone, I'm not speaking on behalf of the military, but I will tell you, it's become politically untenable to disapprove any kind of budget raises, but yet all of us in the Defense Department know that there's a lot of money that gets spent or allocated here that's not really to the end that gets us better warfighting capabilities. And Congress has a distinct responsibility there too. It's one of their purse string responsibilities. So this discussion is one that I think we can look at the historical experience of the tit for tat back and forth between Congress and the presidency. But at this point, Biden's actions, I don't think, are out of alignment with most of the preceding executives in my lifetime. From my recollection, going mostly cognizant recollection to Reagan, we went into Grenada. There was no congressional authority used there. There was some expanse later. Bush went into Panama, again, same thing. Clinton, the Kosovo and Macedonia. Now, I was a commissioned officer then. There wasn't any congressional guidance on his initial actions there. We've seen one after another. Bush Jr., Iraq, Afghanistan, and then just a number of things that go on that Congress has a role to get involved. If they feel it needs to be limited, they need to use their constitutional authority to do so. If they don't, the president is supposed to be checked. He's not checking himself necessarily. And I think we have to be, that's a little realpolitik-ish, but I think that's the reality of the situation. We watch it time and again. I see a lot of gnashing of teeth, but very little action on the part of Congress to use their constitutional authority and responsibility in this regard.
Well, something that you said really struck me, because it seems like, certainly, and again, I speak best from my lifetime and my experience, but going back to the early 2000s, you saw obviously this big shift of the use of force by the Bush administration under that time, George W. Bush administration, in the wake of 9/11 and other events. Arguably an abuse of that power across the board, a number of things, the most obvious being going to war with Iraq over this accusation of weapons of mass destruction, a narrative which turned out to be completely false. At that time, also without the support of most of the European nations who had been allies in the first Iraq war. But the point I wanted to make, on reflecting on something you said, was Congress appears not only to, let me say it this way, it's not as if the president is usurping this power from them. They're abdicating the responsibility. Congress does not want the responsibility of making these decisions, going back to their constituents and having to explain themselves every 2 years on why they did or didn't do something. Much easier to pass the buck, have the president or the executive make the decision, and then complain about it later if things go wrong, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, well, the immortal words, and I won't quote the man, but there was I was for it until I was against it. That tends to be a common refrain. No, that's not how things work.
Well, let me ask, let's talk a little bit about, so beyond the Constitution, which we touched on, there was this thing called the War Powers Act, the War Powers Resolution, set up in 1973. Why don't you, if you wouldn't mind giving a little bit of context of what was that? Why did it come about? What was the environment in which Congress decided it was time to restrain the power of the executive?
Yeah, well, 500,000 troops in Southeast Asia certainly was an extent. Well, we had seen first Korea. Truman had put troops in, a lot of gnashing of teeth then. Vietnam scales up. You've got the Johnson administration putting, as I said, 500,000 troops. Now you're up to the Nixon era. And there's a willingness to say, okay, there has to be some limit on this. So there was some structure on that limit, which everybody can read on the screen there. But you're looking at certain time.
And just sorry to interrupt, but just to say, for those who are just listening and not looking, what it basically says is that the intention was to ensure that, let me go back and say purpose, right, was to fulfill the intent of the framers of the Constitution and ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the president will apply to the introduction of the United States Armed Forces into hostilities. It specifically says that, reminding of Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, that's Congress that has the power to make war, but that the executive has responsibility or can respond when imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, whether pursuant to a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or national emergency created by an attack. So in other words, the president is fully authorized to conduct hostilities, already authorized by Congress, to respond to attacks or imminent threats on the U.S. or against the armed forces of the U.S. anywhere in the world, and then under proper circumstances to rescue endangered citizens. That was the intent of the limitation. Scott, you made an interesting point, which was, and I agree with you, it's been kind of respected in the breach and not in the law, in that sort of presidents after presidents. That was 73. That was Nixon. Since then, have violated it in spirit, if not in law, and Congress hasn't really done anything. So, is that a fair assessment of where we've come to?
Absolutely. And while they wanted to return it back to the Constitution, I was like, well, the Constitution empowers the president and empowers Congress. They're both functioning. If they both function, then they'll collide, and Congress needs to take the appropriate check and balance role that they have. So, so we can talk the 1973 resolution. The idea was the president would come back after a certain period of time, report on status, get an update from Congress, either continue or cease. Well, that doesn't necessarily happen. And I think we could advance it probably to the discussion now, post 9/11. We pass another kind of authorization from Congress that says, hey, we can interdict or take actions against these terrorists because we can't possibly approve every war fighting effort. But, that's expanded. The reason we are in Yemen today is because of the 2001 authorization. We have conducted over 300 different attacks into Yemen over the last 6-7 years. So back to the original discussion, this is highly relevant because we've been doing this very thing under various administrations in Yemen specifically for quite some time during the Civil War. We've supported it, backed it, etc. Congress hasn't had any more authority given except by the 2001 resolution that gave blanket authorization. Well, not blanket authorization, but they gave limited authorization, which has turned into blanket authorization to police terrorism around the globe. And the presidents have said, thank you very much. I have all that I need. We'll see you whenever I feel it fit. And really that, no president feels beholden to Congress for any of that, because Congress keeps approving their budgets and keeps sending the resources, et cetera. Continuing resolution after continuing resolution goes on. Where's the check and balance out of Congress? I don't see it. I really can't. I have a hard time faulting presidents for fulfilling their war-making responsibilities. I do see Congress as deficient. They're not using their constitutional authority appropriately.
Okay, I think that's very helpful, and I think adds some clarity even for me in what I was trying to articulate. I do think it's important that we find this balance, and that Congress takes their responsibility here in this situation for obvious reasons. One of which is we seem to be sort of mushrooming in these types of conflicts. By stating the obvious, Russia, Ukraine, where we've been spending enormous financial resources, if not physical and human resources, Israel, Gaza, and then this situation, just 3 specific ones now. Scott, when you and I last spoke in November, it was about a week or 2 after the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel. The invasion or action into Gaza had not yet happened. It was imminent. There were tanks and other forces clustering on the border. A lot of transpired, a lot of comments, criticisms from all sides. Let's just broaden out for a few minutes, and then I want to move on. But since we last spoke, where are we? What has happened in the escalation? We've talked enough, I suppose, enough about the Houthi involvement now, but compared with what you thought might have happened then, any surprises, and where do you think we are at this point? And then we'll go on to where are we going from here. But at least, up to date, where are we? Anything that's caught you by surprise?
As far as Israeli action, they were a little more deliberate than I thought, which, I applauded them for the way they've gone about their fight. While you'll hear the media decry genocide, et cetera, about Israeli efforts, the Israelis have taken on enormous sacrifice of their own soldiers, something that an American army would not be willing to do. 8 to 11, I think, Israeli IDF troops were killed because they spent so much time warning that it gave away the surprise of the attack, and then the Israeli attack fizzled. And that's one example of many. The Israelis have been very deliberate. Now, they are destroying all sorts of infrastructure and everything that they can. And I think they've been very successful. I was quite shocked that the hostages were released as quickly as they were. I didn't think that the Hamas would be that willing, but Hamas came to the table with hostages. There was a, quote unquote, truce, ceasefire for a little bit. But, those things went on, and then they moved on, and Israel did exactly what they said. And we're going right back to war. The war has not ended. We will prosecute this war until the end of which we feel secure. We're not there yet. So this is ongoing. I think Israel seems to be standing alone. They've gotten mixed messages from every Western power, and yet they still stand and continue to stay online with what they want to do. And I think the truth is probably their conviction will persevere over everything else. The U.S. administration has been, providing resources, but the rhetoric has been different. It kind of vacillates a little bit. But overall, I think everyone realizes truth, realpolitik really is at play. Hamas can no longer be the power that wields in Gaza, and whatever that means, if it's going to be, some kind of mandate that oversees it from Egypt or somewhere else, they're going to come to some resolution that once Hamas has been subjugated. And truly, the Israelis are still looking for their hostages to be free. They're doing everything they can, and you got to understand their mindset. Like, the U.S. military has a mindset that says we won't leave anybody behind. In Israel, that Holocaust legacy, we are not going to leave a single person in jeopardy. We're going to get the body, but we're going to get something back. We are not leaving this unanswered. We're not going to go through that again. Never again. They will not forget. So I think they have resolved, and at great cost. That's what amazes me too. Is the Israeli economy is suffering because a lot of their soldiers are business people. This is a reservist force, and they're willing to. They are willing to endure a lot, and I think that is really misunderstood by most. They think the difficulties. They just think it's a professional army like all these other militaries. We just send volunteers. Nope, this is a volunteer army that has gone in at a reserve status, and they're willing to prosecute this war. And you don't see the ranks divided in Israel. So it's those things are, I won't say a surprise, but it's still very impressive to see when it actually is coming about. Now, the surprises have been how quickly pro-Hamas, it just shocks me that people could look at the atrocities committed by an absolute barbaric attack and then say that there was something valid with that. And it was literally the blood was not dry yet, and people were coming out pro-Hamas, and it
I
was
think
going.
what was the most shocking about that for me was that the hotbeds of this sort of pro-Hamas agitation and just complete ignorance was coming out of our universities across the U.S. and Europe, which again just goes to illustrate the complete intellectual rot of thinking in these institutions that have, it used to be back in, the day when we were in graduate school, that this was a lunatic fringe. And now the inmates are running the asylum. Like, these crazy ideas have become completely dominant, and they break apart very quickly when interrogated. I love to watch these videos of students being interviewed where they're actually tested. Here are the ideals of Hamas. Do you support this? Subjugation of women, and they can do this. And of course, the answer is no. But they're completely ignorant, don't understand it. But it's frightening to me that level of ignorance, that this is coming. And by the way, you get the privilege of paying $50,000 or $60,000 a year to have your children, learn this absolute garbage. Let's move on. Let's go to the challenge. This is the challenge, and you started to talk about it a little bit, but I just want to go to, how does this actually end? Specifically, meaning, let's talk about some specific paths. I want to do a little bit of sort of just one comment, which Biden, sort of yesterday said, no, these strikes have not stopped the attacks, nor are they expected to. So maybe we should talk about where you see this going in terms of the evolution of the conflict with the Houthis, situation in Gaza. I wanted also, and I might be jumping ahead a little bit, but it's always worth asking the question of who benefits in these situations, and for the audience to just remember that today the U.S. is by far the largest spender on military and defense equipment, approaching, I think this was still an estimate at the time, but some $877 billion, more than three times the amount of China. Russia is basically 10% of that. And then you look at the arms producing companies, and not surprisingly, 5 of the top 10, in fact, the top 5 are U.S. industry, U.S. companies producing somewhere around $150 billion. So we can never look at a situation without looking at the financial interests and the incentives. One of the things that struck me when I was looking at this and with some relatively new data from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, data for 2022, how much this has shifted from the year before. So the U.S. Exported about $14.5 billion last year. Russia in the year before the special military operation in the sanctions regime was basically at about half of that. So there was like 36% global market share to Russia's 18. Well, that's now fallen. Russia's now the number 3 exporter of military goods. France, and then most of that, as you know, is to Middle East and Africa. France now also sort of losing share to the U.S. at Russian or Australian submarine deals aside. I'm not sure if that has anything to do with it. But if you look at war is clearly big business for the U.S. and couched in all sorts of terms. But I think I'm leading the witness, and so I'm going to stop and I'm just going to go back up to the question: how does this end? Where are we? And let's go specifically with the Houthi conflict, because that's one where I think you started to talk a little bit about Gaza and how this could have an off ramp and a wind down, maybe unacceptable to much of the world. But the escalation and sort of moving up the escalation ladder with the Houthis and now another country's involvement seems to open up a new vector and a new danger.
Yeah. Well, first off, we're back to discussing Iran and what's its intents. They seem to hold the cards. Escalation, de-escalation, that'll be Iran's choice. Iran has chosen to escalate through Hamas. Now, I've heard various reports that said, no, Hamas acted independently of Iran and Iran didn't know about it. I'm like, yeah, okay, maybe. But Iran certainly is a proponent of it now. And then we see the Houthis, they're cranking things up. We see Hezbollah sitting there. Now, none of these people are going to take actions with Iranian dissent. If Iran says no, they're not going to take, specifically Hezbollah, and they're the one to really watch. Whether we see this escalate or de-escalate, it'll be Hezbollah actions backed by Iranian intent. And I think that's what we want to watch most specifically. Now, the latest attacks in Iraq and Syria are certainly related to Iranian threat levels. They feel like they may be threatened. You're seeing them lash out. Now this thing with Pakistan, which is really complicated with the Baluchi folks, and it's funny. They're like, we're attacking the Baluchis in Pakistan, and the Pakistanis go attack the Baluchis in Iran, and they're yelling at each other. You can't kill the bad guys in my territory. I kill those bad. It's like, it's just almost funny. But then you go, wait, there's something more going on here. Iran is in a very tenuous space, and I think they really feel a lot of pressure here. So while they're rational, I don't know as all their actions are going to flow rationally, because they're under constant pressure. And I think that's what highlights it. Pakistan is still a de facto ally of the West in many ways. They're a nuclear power. They have a concern with India as their dominant thing. So Iran they need that settled too. So, there's a shrewd political approach by the West would be to start leveraging Pakistan and these other forces on Iran and sanctions on Iran. Iran is so very vulnerable if we'll pull the levers. This administration has chosen to take the pressure off of the Iranian regime. And so the Iranian regime, as we've seen, has taken a lot of activity that they weren't able to project power previously under a heavy sanctions regime. So, while it's in Iran's decision metrics to see where we escalate or de-escalate, there are things we can do to induce them either or limit them in what they do. So that, long and short of it, what do we see as an off-ramp? We see an aggressive policy from the West, led by the United States, heavy sanctions on the Iranian regime, as we had previous administration. That takes a lot of the funding off. Their oil revenues go down. We drive energy up, and our production of energy in the West, Iranian oil and their prices, they're all precipitated upon a certain barrel price. We drop it below that. There's a lot of problems that go away when you can't pay for stuff. And I just keep looking at that and going, energy is our big economic tool to wage this fight. And I'm saying that as an American military officer used to the combat space. The economic weapon of oil production probably has far more benefit to us in our strategic role than anything else. And, When we signed Bretton Woods to protect the global sea lanes and keep globalism alive, that's kind of the mandate we took. And we took an all hands approach, keep oil prices right, keep the market stable. And people that violated that, we put them in their place. And we put them in their place a lot economically, sometimes militarily. We still, while Bretton Woods isn't really adhered to anymore, that's really why we're all here in this region. And that's why the U.S. still does the policing of the shipping lanes. And that legacy is still ours. So let's act on it and let's take those actions. And, to me, that's the most humanitarian thing we can do is get Iranian influence out of that region and limit it severely. Then we can go in and help sort out the Houthi crisis and the humanitarian crises there and a number of other things. And, and Hamas and Hezbollah, then stop saber rattling because they don't have the support that they've got right now. There's a lot of benefits to that kind of an approach.
Right. Wow, there was a lot in your, let's call that your closing comments. There was so much there that we could talk about for hours more, and I'd like to, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up for today. Scott, I thank you again for being with me today. I'm looking forward to having another chat in, let's call it another 2 or 3 months, because I have a feeling this is not going to end overnight, and we're going to see further developments. For those of you watching on YouTube and you've enjoyed this, benefited you, please don't forget to give it a like and share, turn on your notifications bell. Subscribe to my channel, Stonewall channel on YouTube, and I'm active on Twitter at MW_Stonewall. And so once again, everybody, thank you. And Scott, thank you very much. Great to be with you today.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, sir.